Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, is destiny something that is immovable and written in stone? Or is it something that is subject to the free will of every individual?
I believe that it's both. Given infinite time, every possible outcome to every single situation will occur at some point or the other, which means that it is written in stone. However, which one happens now and which one comes next? That is a question of one's own choices and free will.
If time and space are literally infinite, then it is mathematically certain. Infinities do strange things to probabilities. Even if an event occurs once in a billion lives, it is still guaranteed to happen eventually, in infinite time. So I suppose if all beings have even the slightest chance to enter Nirvana in a given lifetime, it is eventually guaranteed.
Indeed. The seeds of the past become the fruits of the present and the future. What we sow now definitely determines what we reap later. It is this cycle of sowing and reaping that we cannot really escape, at least until we do escape it for good.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the character Mahakasyapa. Who is Mahakasyapa? What role does he play in the texts? How does this role change over time? We hope you enjoy. So, into the core of it. Who is Mahakasyapa?
Mahakasyapa was one of the Buddha's 10 principal disciples. You have noticed that each of the disciples we've discussed before have something that they're known for. Shariputra was foremost in wisdom, Mahāyāna was foremost in psychic powers, and in the case of Mahakasyapa, he's foremost in ascetic practice. He is one of the most famous figures in Buddhist history, and he can be seen very frequently in the texts. He has two sort of textual lives, one that exists in the Pali and Taisho canons, and one that exists in other texts that are outside of either canon. We'll start with the canonical life, which we can kind of think of as the historical life, and then later we'll move on to the life that happens in the other texts, which we can't really say is historical. In the canonical life, he was born into a Brahmin family in the kingdom of Magadha, which is now northeast India and Nepal. You'll note that so far, every disciple we've discussed was born to a Brahmin or a Kshatriya family. This term Brahmin refers to the ancient Indian social caste system. Brahmins were priestly figures who were very wealthy and powerful. Kshatriyas were warrior and soldier castes, and they were often very wealthy and connected as well because they directly served the Brahmins. Brahmins typically had the ability in their family system to renounce and just leave to seek spiritual enlightenment instead of laboring for the family unit, and they were able to do so without damaging the material circumstances of that family unit. Lower castes did not have that luxury or ability due to their being poorer than the Brahmins and Kshatriyas. In addition to this ability that they also had a sort of predestined pathway to do so, as they often served as religious and political figures, and this role became a dynastic and an inherited role. This is how they became so wealthy and connected in the first place. There's no separation in ancient Indian society between the religious and the political, the church and the state, so to speak. And so these Brahmins were at the top of the totem pole, so to speak, given the fact that they were these religious intelligentsia as well as this sort of connected and wealthy figure in the community. Mahakasyapa was born into this environment to a Brahmin landlord, and he was said to be born with the 32 physical marks of a great man, the same marks which the Buddha was born with. These marks include wheel-shaped marks on his feet, webbed fingers and toes, a knob on his head, golden skin, extremely long arms, and a tuft of white hair between the eyes. These physical characteristics were said to come about when somebody was destined for great kingship or great spiritual leadership. And in this case, just like in the case of the Buddha, Mahakasyapa was destined for the latter. He never wanted to live a worldly life like his family wanted for him, and even played tricks on his family as they tried to make him get married and try to commit to the path of great kingship, or at least great political power. Eventually, he met the Buddha, and he was completely struck by the Buddha and his teaching, and so he eventually asked to be ordained. As the Buddha ordained him, he is said to have given Mahakassapa 3 directives to practice: to develop a lively sense of fear and regard towards his fellow monastics, regardless of their status, to attentively listen and practice the teachings of the Buddha, and to live in mindfulness. Accordingly, Mahakassapa took up the 13 renunciatory practices. These include things like living in the wilderness, living only off of alms, and wearing rag robes, or robes that are made out of rags and tatters. Then he became an enlightened disciple in only 9 days after doing this. Mahakassapa then became one of the Buddha's foremost disciples, being excellent both in his ability to teach and encourage monks and in his ability to teach and kind of convert lay people. He was known to be a very critical and stern character. He would often chastise monks and lay people alike for doing things wrong and living their life not according to the Dharma. It is thought that his practices of asceticism left him a little more abrasive than the average disciple, and thus he is said to have butted heads with several of the Buddha's other followers and members of the Sangha. In a moment, we'll talk about his contentious relationship with Ananda, the Buddha's attendant and cousin. However, throughout his life, Mahakassapa often followed the Buddha around when preaching, and often went to teach and administrate on behalf of the Sangha to various regions of India. If you remember from the Nibbāna Sutta, when the Buddha passed away, the ceremonies were delayed by 7 days to allow Mahakassapa to get there. When he finally did get there, Mahakassapa did not weep or cry or do anything like that, but instead paid homage to the Buddha at his feet, which was a very common form of veneration that took place in India at the time. After the Buddha died and the funerals were all over with, it was said that out of all of the infighting and the doubt over the future of the Sangha, Mahakassapa arose as the next leader of the community. After this, he set up the first Buddhist council, and with the remaining original disciples of the Buddha and foremost members of the community, they figured out what to do now that the Buddha was gone, how to collect and record and preserve the sermons, and also how to administrate the Sangha going forward. Mahakassapa's death is not at all discussed in any of the Pali or Taisho canon texts, but it does come up in the texts outside of the canon that come about later in history. We'll discuss what is going on in those texts in a moment.
What role does he play in the texts?
In the canonical texts, Mahakassapa is a foremost disciple of the Buddha, and he steps up to the role of leader of the Sangha after the Buddha's death. The fact that the Buddha's funeral was put off by 7 days, and also the fact that he kind of arose as the leader of the community afterwards, should show how important he was to not only the Buddha, but to Buddhists in their early infancy, in the infancy of this movement called Buddhism. During his life, he was said to have butted heads with several members of the community for being abrasive and strict, like I said. We mentioned a moment ago, for example, that he had a very strained relationship with Ananda, who was the Buddha's cousin and was his attendant, and eventually became the one to help preserve and record the sermons of the Buddha from remembering them orally and then writing them down on palm leaves. The full story has to do with the fact that Ananda was the Buddha's closest attendant and was closest to him for the largest amount of time while the Buddha was alive, and yet Ananda was commonly regarded as being unenlightened until after the Buddha's death. Because of this, Mahakassapa often thought of Ananda as sort of a nepotism baby. He was the Buddha's cousin, and he was there all the time, and he thought that Ananda didn't really deserve to be that close to the Buddha. He would have preferred to be much closer to the Buddha himself, and that would actually have eventually fit in with his role as the Buddha's successor. Mahakassapa was also highly critical of Ananda for letting women become a part of the community. Not only did Ananda convince the Buddha to allow them to join, but he also sought out these new nuns and assisted them in becoming ordained. He then also laid the foundations for many of the monastic rules that these new nuns had to follow. Mahakassapa was also very critical of Ananda because the women that he brought into the community actually thought that Ananda was a superior monk to Mahakassapa on some of the doctrinal points that they used to teach about. This made Mahakassapa very upset because Ananda was still unenlightened. Because Mahakassapa felt this way about Ananda, it can be said that at the death of the Buddha, there were roughly 2 factions among the Sangha: the Mahakassapa faction and the Ananda/pro-nun faction. Mahakassapa's faction won out, but only after considerable infighting, and after this fighting concluded with the Ananda faction, they still had to allow women to be a part of the community. However, on the other side, Mahakassapa charged Ananda with several offenses against the Sangha that violated the rules for monks and nuns, And therefore, Ananda was almost not permitted to come and participate in the recording and compiling of all of the Buddha's sermons during the First Buddhist Council. In the end, like I said, there are and were permitted to be Buddhist nuns, but their status continued to be rather contentious throughout history. If we zoom out and we look at the canonical and non-canonical texts together, then Mahākassapa was born to be the successor of the Buddha, and was groomed for it and set up for it throughout his entire life, even in the parts where he was not with the Sangha. Some of this is hagiography, or the heavily embellished biography of a very spiritually important figure, and some of it actually happened canonically. One example of this is being born with the 32 physical marks. That happens to very, very, very few characters in any of the texts, be they canonical or not. And this is an example where we can look to it and say that he was destined to be the successor of the community from the start. Again, there are also several episodes in his life that are cited as spots where he is being set up by the Buddha to be his successor. You'll remember that canonically, Mahākassapa is also said to have mastered mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma, as is shown during the flower sermon. This sermon, if you recall, is the one where the Buddha held up a flower to all of his disciples without saying anything, and all of them became very confused and started asking what was going on, and even started trying to interpret what was going on, except Mahākassapa. All Mahākassapa did was smile in response. The Buddha then proceeded to preach about mind-to-mind transmission and about how Mahākassapa was the only one who had gotten it. At another point in his life, there was also an exchange of robes between Mahākassapa and the Buddha, and this is thought of as having symbolized Mahākassapa cementing his place as the Buddha's successor. This exchanging of robes was a very widespread ritual in early Indian religions that usually meant something like acknowledging the individuals as being equal, or at least acknowledging one individual as being the successor to the other. Finally, of course, the Buddha's funeral was said to have been put on hold as they waited for Mahākassapa to arrive, because he was theoretically the guest of honor. All of these episodes point to him setting himself up as the successor to the Buddha, but doing so in contention and competition with Ananda and with other members of the community.
It's hard to listen to this in the current day and not immediately turn against Mahākassapa at this point, if in nothing else for his misogyny. And I'm having a hard time figuring out the right balance of applying modern morality and concepts of equality to somebody who lived this far back. But at the same time, I think I've worked with people who are a lot like this guy, and they were all jerks. And I'm getting the impression that this guy was gonna be something similar. But like, he's also important in the religion and regarded as enlightened, while Ananda isn't. So, I'm not sure how to judge this, I guess. I know what my knee-jerk reaction is, but I also suspect that there's a lot of people who would not appreciate that reaction, especially coming from a 20th century white dude.
You're right to point out that the misogyny is kind of an issue. And like I've been saying before, in addition to the misogyny, he's also said to have been very abrasive and strict and kind of mean to a lot of the members of the community, both monastic and lay people. And so I think that it's kind of canonical that he's a little bit of a jerk at times, and there's a specific reason for that in each of the texts where it happens. We haven't read and discussed any of them yet, but when we get there, we'll see that there's something about him that allows him to say things that are not affectionate speech, say things that are not equitable speech, or I should say concordant speech, right? There are times where he seems to violate some of those rules we've talked about before about what you can and cannot say, or what you should and should not say. And there's always a teaching reason for it in those texts in particular, but it doesn't really excuse the fact that he was being a jerk to start with. And the misogyny issue is huge. You know, I mean, we've dealt with that from the get-go, because Ananda first initiated the idea to the Buddha, and the Buddha rejected him 3 times. And Ananda asked another time, and finally the Buddha was like, okay, fine. You can make it happen, but they have to do this and this and this and this and this. they have to do all these different things that the male monastics did not have to do, right? To this day, there's almost 100 more rules for nuns, according to the Vinaya texts, than there are for male monastics. And the reason for this is actually because so many of these rules deal with the nuns having to keep themselves out of sight of men, right? Because their very existence is said to distract the men from their mindfulness and to incite desire in the men. And some of them have to do with menstruation. You have to go through all these special rituals to make sure that the impurity of your menstruation does not interfere with not only your mindfulness and your training, but that of others. And so what it boils down to is that so many of these different rules just have to do with the fact that you have to make up for your womanhood. And that's horrible, right? And those are things that actually the Buddha preached to these women, not actually Mahakasyapa or Ananda. And so Mahakasyapa rejecting these nuns and the concept of having nuns in this movement is terrible, but it's certainly not an original idea. And I wouldn't even say that he is the worst offender in that regard, because he didn't really set the Dharma that the Buddha is preaching. He didn't have any of the decision-making ability that the Buddha had whenever coming up with these rules and stuff. He was almost like an enforcer, and he was just one of the parties that said, I just don't want this to happen. Eventually, when it did, it was one of the concessions that he had to make to allow them to continue to practice, and he did it begrudgingly, but only just because it moved the council forward after the death of the Buddha and allowed him to be the successor and allowed the progress to start being made on recording and compiling the sermons.
So, just because somebody else did it first is still not a good excuse, even if it was the Buddha doing it.
Exactly.
We've been over this several times already, so I think we're at this point kind of beating a dead horse about it. I'll try to reserve further judgment on Mahakasyapa, at least, until we read some more of the stories that include him. So, back to the script. How does Mahakasyapa's role change over time?
During his life and in the early canonical texts, he is seen as the ascetic figure who loves solitude, but is very cold and strict to other members of the community, and is groomed for succeeding the Buddha from the very beginning. He's no doubt a very, very important character, but the canonical texts alone don't set him up for what comes next. What comes next is that he is regarded as the first patriarch of those schools of Buddhism which engage directly with this mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma that we've talked about, such as Chan and Zen Buddhism. Mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma involves a lot of studying and teaching and meditating and working up to a point where all of that teaching and learning is given context all at once in one big ritual, where the teacher, in their ability to make use of skillful means, reveals the secret piece of the puzzle to the student, who then becomes enlightened all at once and can then go and teach and give the Dharma themselves. This is what is said to have happened to Mahakasyapa during the flower sermon that we mentioned earlier, and it's a ritual that goes on in Chan and Zen Buddhism to this day. It is this role as the first patriarch and the master of mind-to-mind transmission that causes some of this non-canonical embellishment of Mahakasyapa's life to come about later in history. It is because of this stuff that he becomes thought of as sort of like a second Buddha after the death of the original one. We should not, however, think of Mahakasyapa as a fully realized Buddha yet, because of something that happens in the story of his death. You'll remember that there is no direct canonical account of Mahakasyapa's death. The only stories we have come from China and Southeast Asia, and they look back to the story of Mahakasyapa's death to find the origins of a very interesting death practice that they undergo. The story goes that at the time of his death, Mahakasyapa set himself up in a special cave, and knowing that his death was approaching, as a mostly enlightened person would, vowed to sit in meditation until the arrival of Maitreya, the Buddha of the future. This vow was upheld, and he is said to still be sitting and waiting in this cave, in deep meditation to this day. Which cave it is obviously a very localized thing. There are caves all over Asia which have a statue of Mahakasyapa doing this, and in a way they are all understood as being Mahakasyapa's physical body in their cave doing the meditation. This is symbolic, of course, because Mahakasyapa did not have that many physical bodies, but it's also related to the concept of non-duality. Just because that's not the Mahakassapa that lived and died in India over the course of roughly 120 years, according to the legends, just because it's not that body doesn't mean that they don't have Mahakassapa themselves in their special cave in China, Southeast Asia, etc. The story goes that Mahakassapa will awaken and welcome Maitreya into this world whenever Maitreya gets here, and Mahakassapa's remains will be burned in a funeral ceremony. This has led to a fascinating death practice where the practitioner mummifies themselves and has their remains built into a statue, which is meditating until the next Buddha shows up. The self-mummification process is said to take 1,000 days in some versions, and it involves special rituals and meditations, and during this time, the person who is dying will consume special herbs and incense and other non-food items to actually prepare their body for mummification while they're still alive. At a certain stage, the person is placed into a statue and is thought of as occupying that statue in deep meditation until Maitreya arrives. It's not terribly clear at which stage of this process that the person technically dies. First off, medical death is a very unclear state to begin with. We commonly think of it as the complete cessation of the functions of the heart, lungs, and brain, and the rest of the organs, but we have the medical technology to keep people breathing and keep their blood circulating, even when all these things fail. Additionally, the human body can survive even given the failure of many of its organs. You can survive with only some of your heart, only one lung, only a piece of your liver, only one kidney, and so on and so forth. And so that being the case, it's a non-trivial question in Western medicine deciding when actually someone has truly died. To make matters more difficult, in this tradition, in Southeast Asian and East Asian Buddhism, they haven't really made use of medical death as a metric for deciding whether or not a person is still technically alive. So the idea is that the practitioner has entered into a deep meditative state that involves still being kind of alive, but having bodily processes slowed down to the point where heartbeats, breaths, and other processes now operate on the scale of eons rather than minutes. So instead of having a heart rate of 65 beats per minute, it might be 14 beats per eon or something like that. So what we might look at and call medically dead, they look at and say just slowed way down. This practice of self-mummification has historically taken place in Tibet and China, and now it mainly takes place in Southeast Asia and also in Japanese esoteric Buddhism. In fact, Kukai, the founder of esoteric Buddhism in Japan, is said to be meditating in this way and waiting for Maitreya at one of the temples he founded in Japan during his lifetime.
Worth noting that if you look up pictures of this, they do have pictures of the mummified folks as well. As part of the religion, you're looking at a meditating monk, but when you look at it visually, you're looking at a corpse. So do be aware if you want to go looking for this on your own. Just like with stuff we have said before, there are pictures and they can be a little grotesque.
Yes, viewer discretion is advised. Additionally, you might also find that when you look this up, you only find pictures of statues. And that actually happens quite frequently. But you can actually see, if you look a little bit deeper, that sometimes they have done x-rays of these statues, and there will actually be a skeleton inside the statue itself. And so some of these self-mummified characters are self-mummified and kind of left to the elements a little bit, as in they're not built into anything. They are actually just a corpse sitting in a meditative position. But some of them have actually had their bodies placed into a statue through the back, and we actually don't even know how many statues out there have bodies in them. It's still an ongoing process to do x-rays on these statues and discover which one is made of just stone or wood or metal, and which one also has a person in it.
That concludes our discussion. We hope you have enjoyed this week's episode on Mahakassapa. Join us next week where we'll be discussing the Buddhist perspective on the family. What is the Buddhist perspective on family? How ought lay people have and maintain a family? How ought monks and nuns have and maintain a family? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. See you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
and this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.